So my name is Brittany Drysdale. I'm a community animator at the Centre for Social Innovation, which is a co-working centre, community and launchpad for social entrepreneurs. Today we're going to be talking about buying out the boss, which is a very exciting idea. Centre for Social Innovation is a co-working space, community and launchpad for social entrepreneurs with 3 locations in Toronto and 1 in New York. So we catalyze social innovation. We support the work of social entrepreneurs, which includes co-ops. So we're very excited to be hosting today. This is the 3rd and final series in this workshop, and we're moving our discussion to the future possibilities that the co-op model might tackle. For instance, as baby boomers age, there could be one of the largest transfers of wealth ever seen, which is very exciting in this day and age. As baby boomers retire and sell their businesses, those private businesses become profitable democracies and shift employees to owners. And the shift of employees to owners can create a lasting legacy for retiring boomers and stability, agency, and opportunity for the future. So, if anyone is interested in speaking, in asking any questions during our series today, we're going to have a facilitated question and answer session at the end. But our speakers have generously offered to take questions during as well. So if you have any questions, don't be shy. Raise your hand and ask your questions. Our first topic is the coming transformation. Why business succession planning may be a hidden gold mine for social innovation. And our first speaker is Ragoonanan. He's a business lawyer with Gardiner, Miller, Arnold. He's got extensive experience and expertise with startups, changing business structure, and merging with or acquiring another business. So, on behalf of CSI and all of you, please help me welcome Warren.
Thank you very much. So as Brittany mentioned, I'm a business lawyer. So I spend a good chunk of my day helping clients buy and sell businesses. And I've done a lot of deals with small and medium-sized businesses where the owner's looking to retire and looking to do succession planning, both formally and informally as well. I've seen the potential of this sector firsthand. Right? There is a lot of wealth, a lot of knowledge out there, but it really is a matter of being able to tap into that potential. And the gold mine that Brittany's mentioning that's in our title, it's not obvious at first blush, right? Mainly because SMEs are not at the forefront of our minds when we think about business. We tend to think about large multinational corporations. But the truth is that there is potential there if you know what to look for and know how to approach it. To understand the potential, you have to contrast the established small and medium-sized businesses with the challenges of running a startup. So I asked the question, why do so many startups fail in the first 5 years? That's something that every startup struggles with to be able to get its legs, right? So I've thrown in a few possibilities. Maybe they don't have a business plan, or it's not as sound or as thorough as it could be. Maybe they've overestimated their competitive advantage. They don't necessarily have the intelligence out there on what the competition is like and how other businesses have been successful and able to get ahead. Maybe they have limited help, right? Maybe it's the entrepreneur who is focused so hard on getting the business up and running and finding the space and being able to serve that there's not enough hours in the day to do things like marketing and other things that are needed in order to make the business operation. Ultimately, though, they struggle because they don't have clients, they don't have customers, which means that they don't have a revenue stream, a stable revenue stream that essentially allows the business to operate and function properly. Contrast that with the small and medium-sized enterprises. The startups phase for these businesses is long past. The entrepreneurs, the owners that started this, they struggled through all of this and managed to create an established business. So they end up with loyal clients, customers. They end up with knowledgeable employees and the entrepreneur themselves. They end up with a tested competitive advantage that allows them to survive for a certain period of time. What that means, and this is the essence of where the gold mine is the small and medium-sized businesses have managed to generate something that we call in the M&A parlance goodwill. I don't know if anybody's heard of this concept. It's an accounting concept. The legal term is going concern. The business term you might have heard is synergy. But the idea is that the business is more than the sum of its parts. The entrepreneur has managed to organize something, to create a space where the employees, the owners are able to work together, use the assets of the business to generate the trust needed to generate a stable and loyal client base. That's the gold mine, right? There's this hundreds of millions of dollars or tens of millions of dollars of goodwill that's out there in the small and medium-sized sector, right? That there's not really a lot of thought about how that goodwill is going to be translated down to the next generation, right? In preparing for this presentation, I went to the Canadian Federation of Independent Businesses website and took a look at some of their reports. And I've got two graphs for you, and I promise this is the only numbers in my whole presentation. Figure 1 is basically the existence of business succession plan by current business owners. So CFIB took a survey. They did one survey in 2006 and they did another one in 2011 to update it, asking their members various questions about succession planning and how ready they are. So the graph on your left, my right, figure 1 there in red shows the percentage of business owners without a succession plan. It's 51%. Right? It's tough to read, but the green represents the owners with a formal plan, and the blue represents the owners with an informal plan, whatever that might mean. But the fact of the matter is that the surveys have shown that the planning hasn't gone in that needs to go in. The next figure, the figure 4, which would be to your right, shows the expected business exit date for many of these respondents, right? Blue is exits within the first 5 years, and green is exits within the first 10 years. It's easily over 50%. So think about that for a second, right? 51% of business owners don't have a formal plan, and they're planning to leave their business within the next 10 years. So what is going to happen to all of this goodwill? Well, hopefully what's going to happen is that co-ops and other buyers will be there to be able to acquire this so that the goodwill's not lost and that the customers continue to be served. And even better, that some of these businesses might be able to get turned into social enterprises. You can see where the gold mine is. But unlocking that potential is actually not as straightforward as you think. Because, as I've seen in my practice over and over again, it's not simply a matter of getting a willing buyer and a willing seller and getting down to negotiate a deal. Oftentimes, if an owner, a vendor, is serious about selling their business, they need to take some steps to get the business ready. Right? It's just like when you sell your house. Russ and I were talking about this before the presentation. Before you put your house on the market, you have to stage it, but you also have to fix things, like the roof, the windows, and all of the things necessary to make the house livable and marketable. In business, it's very much the same way. A lot of the times, the small and medium-sized business owners, they've been struggling just to get that goodwill, right? So there's aspects of the business that maybe they haven't devoted as much attention to as they should. And there's some things that they just don't know. That's one of the reasons why I say here that, you've got two crucial advisors as a business owner, any business owner. At the bare minimum, you need a lawyer and you need an accountant, right? Hopefully with your lawyer, you've seen them once when you incorporate the business. Maybe 6 or 7 years later, if you're doing a big deal, bringing in a partner perhaps, or negotiating some kind of a bank loan, or doing a capital expansion, things like that. And then when you eventually sell your business. So you don't need to see your lawyer very often, but the lawyer should be there to be able to point things out and help organize and deal with the issues that we're talking about right now. The second crucial advisor is the accountant. once your business gets to a certain size, and hopefully even from the outset, you should be getting that accounting advice and tax advice to make sure that you're on side with everything that the Canada Revenue Agency needs you to be on side with. And quite frankly, you could try to go onto the internet or do your own research, but there's just so many of these issues that you don't think about and that these experts can really help with. That's why I say it's pretty crucial that you have at the bare minimum those two. And to give you an example of the kinds of issues that most entrepreneurs don't think about, the minute book. Are people here familiar with the minute book? Do they know what I mean when I talk about it? Just by a show of hands. Good, so about half. So a minute book is a record of a corporation's key decisions. It's got the articles, it's got the bylaws, it's got resolutions and share certificates, right? Many entrepreneurs make the mistaken impression that you just file the articles for your company and you're done. You're incorporated and you're just ready to go. And that's actually not the case. Oftentimes, you actually have to take further steps to put bylaws in place and put directors and officers and issue shares. All of these are housekeeping items. They're not hard, they're not complicated, but they have to be done. And they're easiest to do right when you first incorporate, because as your business grows and expands, right, it starts to become a little bit more difficult to answer these questions. Because you need to know, for example, who your shareholders are and who your directors are if you're planning on selling. Because regardless of the type of deal that you're involved with, your shareholders are going to have a say. And oftentimes, people might make the mistaken assumption that, oh, okay, it's a small business, so there's only one shareholder. But as your business expands and grows, it's quite often that shares are issued to family members, to spouses, to children, to trusts for the purposes of income splitting and tax planning and things like that. So the answer, well, who are the shareholders is not that obvious. And who are the directors is even more important, because the people that occupy that role have to sign off on a lot of things and have a say in how the deal is eventually done. Another part of getting the business ready is tax planning, and I'm not just talking about the nitty-gritty of making sure that the tax returns are filed, but I'm also talking about sitting down with accountants to make sure that the way you sell the business is the most tax-effective and tax-efficient way possible. One of our firm's clients, I did a deal for him a couple of years ago, and his deal went phenomenally well, right? It's just absolutely ideal gold standard for how you want these transactions to go. Because 3 years before we closed, we sat down with him and his accountant and went through the business and did some tax planning and did some tax, what we call reorganizations, transfers of assets out of the business in order to enable him to sell the business more efficiently and defer tax, right? There's something out there, I don't know if you've heard of it, it's called the lifetime capital gains exemption. It's now up to $800,000. It's basically a tax exemption on capital gains for the sales of shares. And in order to meet that exemption, you have to qualify for certain things, and your business has to qualify in certain ways. If you're able to meet that exemption, a lot of entrepreneurs can sell these businesses on a share sale and save a lot of money in tax. But it takes planning, right? It's not the type of thing that you want to start thinking about, 3 weeks before the closing. Another thing that I put up there in terms of getting the business ready for sale is policies, processes, practices, and trade secrets. So what I'm getting at here is a lot of the times when an entrepreneur builds a business, all of these policies and these processes are kind of in the business owner's head. They haven't been put down on paper. And that's a problem, because number one, the entrepreneur likely wants to retire, so if he sells or she sells, they're not going to want to stick around long enough to write all that stuff down. But number two, it's hard to train somebody when you haven't sat down and thought about, okay, if I was to take this business out of my head and try to set up practices in order for other people to be able to run this thing, how would I do it? Delegation, as all of you probably know, is not easy, right? You really do have to sit down and work out roles for different people. And that's not something that can be done overnight or very, very quickly. You know, you really do need to sit down and say, well, what would be the role of my successor here? What is this person's job? How crucial are they? If I've got trade secrets, really, what are they? What is my competitive advantage? This is part of that process of generating goodwill, part of that process of getting the business ready to go. Because otherwise, you don't really have a business to sell. What you have is kind of a job that you control, right? And it's not something that's transferable. The other 2 points, real estates and lease and liabilities and liens, those are the types of things that you're starting to get into a bit more details now, but just making sure that if you occupy a space, that you have a written lease that's capable of being transferred, and that everything's fine with your landlord. This assumes, of course, that the business is dependent on a particular location, which if you're in a retail business, location is crucial, right? If you're in perhaps IT or in some other industry where your business can operate on a virtual basis, this is not as important, right? It might be that perhaps you're more concerned with making sure that the website hosting agreements and the technical aspects of it are sound. But for many businesses where there's an office space, the office is important, and you need to make sure that your lease is valid. Same thing with liabilities and liens. It's funny how many business owners that I talk to that don't realize that liens are registered against their business. When you go in and you open up a line of credit, or you put a bank overdraft or something like that, it's oftentimes that the bank's going to want as much security as it can get, just to make sure that nothing goes offside. And they'll often register liens against the business as part of that, and that's normal. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But you should know about them, right? And you should be prepared when you're selling your business to think about what's going to happen to them. If it's a line of credit, for example, is the buyer going to assume it? Can the buyer assume it? Because remember, this is the bank that's offering the line of credit, not you. And the buyer would have to qualify. Those are the kinds of things that, you know, before you even sit down with your buyer, should be in the back of your mind, right? In order to be able to get ready. So once you've actually sat down and decided, okay, I'm going to go forward and sell, and I think my business is ready, unlocking this potential also requires the vendor to sit down and think about, well, what do they want out of the sale? And as buyers and as co-op buyers, you also should be aware of this to understand what are some of the potential issues. What is the vendor primarily interested in, right? So these are all fairly, I think, self-explanatory, but I'm going to go into them in a little bit of detail. So for example, all the business shareholders have to support the sale. This goes back to what I was saying before about making sure that you've got a minute book up to date that tells you who the shareholders are. Because regardless of the structure of the sale, whether it's assets or shares, the shareholders are going to have a say, right? And if there's somebody out there that might have an issue with the sale of the business, you want to know that now, and you want to do your best to get them on board as early as possible. The second one is kind of a funny point, a buyer who actually has money. That's always nice to have, but it's always not obvious, because most buyers aren't going to sit down and say, well, I don't actually have the money. But there's some red flags there, right? For example, I personally, when I'm advising my clients, dislike deals that involve what's called a vendor take-back mortgage, which is the vendor taking back security, taking back security over the business to secure the purchase price. And I don't particularly like financing conditions either. I approach these deals with the view that it's the seller's problem to make sure the business is ready to sell, right? That's fair, right? He knows his business, she knows her business. They are the ones that understand where all the problems are and what has to be sorted out. I think it's the buyer's problem to make sure that they have the money, right? Don't make that the seller's problem. And so that's really important. And you know, as buyers, you know, and Melissa will go into this in a bit more detail, you should be taking steps to make sure that you have the financing there and not really wasting time trying to negotiate something when you can't pay for it. third point up there, that sellers are looking for a price based on credible business valuation. Price is always the big negotiating point, right? That's the part where, you know, you're going back and forth and you're sitting at the table and you're banging on it and saying, no, I want this, no, I want this. But the truth of the matter is that when you have the price negotiations, what takes out a lot of the stress is being able to at least sit down and figure out a credible method of valuing the business. There are people out there called certified business valuators, and they offer these services. You have to pay for them, obviously, and it's a cost benefit as to whether or not it's worthwhile. But they have techniques and expertise in ways to value a business. And without getting into too much detail, I mean, they use roughly, and this is broad, like roughly 3 different ways. They either value the business based on its assets, they value the basis based on market value, which is what other comparable businesses are doing, or what I see most commonly is that they value the business based on income, right? They take the last few years' worth of financial statements, look at revenues and profits that are coming in, apply a form of multiplier based on what industry you're in, and that's essentially the price that you use. But the idea is that you're not pulling a price out of the air. Vendors are somewhat emotionally connected to their business as well, and sometimes they might overvalue. And obviously, buyer doesn't want to pay too much, but the vendor doesn't want to necessarily get hosed, right? So thinking about outside objective methods of valuing is important. And finally, final point, and this is where the lawyers come in really, is figuring out how to structure the deal. When I say structure, I mean is the vendor going to sell shares of the business, or are they going to sell assets of the business? There's a broad idea out there that if you sell shares, you're assuming liabilities, which is true. And that if you sell assets, you don't have to worry about the business's liabilities, which is kind of true, but not really. Because you've got other statutes out there that kind of can force you to assume liabilities. And oftentimes there's things that can come about that you need to manage. But broadly speaking, the assets versus share conversation is an important conversation to have before anybody signs anything. Because it dictates how the deal is going to be dealt with down the road. So that's what the vendor wants on the negotiation of a sale. But my final slide, which I'm going to end with before we go into Russ, is a little bit about where I often see potential issues crop up on these deals. Due diligence. So due diligence is it's kind of like the legal term for basically researching the business and making sure that it's really a business and you're not paying for nothing. And the buyers are often going to want to see financial statements, records, and negotiate a period to be able to do that. So the seller has to be prepared to open up the books and show the buyer what they've got. And that goes back to the whole getting the business ready to sell. Because if you know that there's records that the buyer wants to see, you can sit down and start organizing those things and making sure that they're together, that the financial statements are scanned to PDF and can be emailed very easily or uploaded to some kind of a data room. Second issues that I see a lot are licenses and regulatory concerns. A lot of businesses kind of take for granted that there's a regulator out there and kind of don't think about, well, you know, yeah, we have this license that we renew every year. What they don't realize is that if you're selling your business, that license has to get transferred. And oftentimes, the regulating authority is going to want to qualify your buyer to make sure that it can be. I act for a lot of pharmacists in the sale of their pharmacies. And one of the top issues that we always have to deal with is making sure that the buyer is qualified by the Ontario College of Pharmacists. And then the second thing that we have to deal with is making sure that the buyer is able to obtain a registration with the Ontario Drug Benefit Plan. These are all little things that you know, they're kind of operating in the back of your mind when you're running a business, but when you're transferring it, they're really important. And oftentimes, by the way, vendors who are part of industry associations can find ready information about these types of regulatory issues and can help the purchaser get introduced to them. The third point, dealing with the landlord real estate. So before I was talking about, well, making sure that your lease is valid. This point is about making sure that the buyer understands that the landlord, if there's a landlord out there, is going to have to approve them. Landlords far and away are one of the most difficult issues that we have to deal with on closing these deals, because more often than not, the landlord has the power to kill the whole deal by simply refusing to assign over the lease. And the landlord has no incentive, really, to do this. They sometimes treat it as a favor, and in a worst case scenario, they sometimes try to exploit the situation. And usually, there's a human dynamic to it, because one of the most dangerous moves I've seen buyers make is to look at the lease and say, I don't like what this says. I'm going to sit down with the landlord and try to negotiate changes to it before the closing day. And why the landlord would accept that, I have no idea. But I see buyers doing it over and over again. And when I ask them that question, well, why would the landlord accept this? I get all kinds of wonky answers. I mean, I had a lawyer once tell me, well, my client's rich, so the landlord will accept whatever he wants. And suffice it to say, that thing nearly fell apart. Last two issues are kind of related to each other. Introduction to the employees, getting the buyers in to meet the employees, perhaps interview them, and making sure that the employees are comfortable enough with the buyer to stay. And the third one is post-closing training and other transfer issues, which are basically having the entrepreneur work for the buyer for a while in training and transition. And there's all kinds of things to consider with that, including how long, how much the buyer is going to pay the owner, whether they're going to be an employee or an independent contractor, things like that. But the point is that you're sitting down and you're thinking about this stuff. And part of the vendor's exercise is thinking about, well, what do I want to do post-retirement, right? If I've sold out to a very large company, they're going to want me to stick around for at least a year. Do I want to do that, right? If I'm trying to retire, then that might be counterproductive to me being able to enjoy my later years. So of course you've got to sit down and you've got to work that stuff out. So thanks very much. That's sort of my kind of overview on where that gold mine is. Happy to take any questions. Sure.
So a logistics question, will we be able to get a copy of your slides?
Absolutely. I can have them emailed.
Your last statement was you have to be willing to sit down and work things out. Who would you advise? You talked about, well, my client is rich, or are you the one as a lawyer who's doing negotiating between the seller, or who is the negotiator?
So this is interesting. This changes depending on the dynamic and what stage you're at. At the very, very beginning of the deal, I do a lot of work with business brokers as well. And oftentimes, the broker sits down with the buyer and the seller, and a very good broker would be advising the seller already on some of the things that I pointed out, and would be sitting down with the buyer and the seller together to kind of work out a price and deal with some of these issues. I would get involved at the very beginning, once they have a price settled. I would sit down, and I think it's advisable for the lawyer to draft a letter of intent, right? So that once you have the core business terms set, and when I say the core business terms, I mean who the buyer is, who the seller is, what the price is. Then you're kind of getting into a conference call in many ways with all of the parties and the advisors to decide on assets versus shares. And then once those four things are sorted out, I would hand it over to the lawyer to deal with some of the more detailed terms. Some of the tax stuff, I generally have the accountants negotiate that accountant to accountant and just advise their clients. But as the process moves from kind of getting the core business terms to the point where you have something to sign, the lawyer takes on a greater role in negotiations and in the details. And the lawyers, they use a term called quarterbacking it, which is basically to coordinate things. But whenever I run into issues that, just say I have a particularly difficult lawyer on the other side, and I've had those a time or two, sometimes I just say, you know what, have these guys talk to each other directly and sort it out and tell us.
I like the quarterback on it because I think that sort of things can fall apart if you don't have that one individual. So I appreciate that you pulled that out of conversations that goes on.
Somebody has to take the lead at the beginning, and it's usually the vendor or it could be the broker. But at some point, there's a transition of the quarterbacking to the lawyer.
Two-part question. So do you more often represent the vendor or the buyer?
Oh, it's half and half. I do both.
Right. Okay.
And I've seen it from both sides. And in fact, I've represented a vendor's estate. The vendor died, and we sold off the business through it's. I've seen many combinations and permutations.
Right. Okay. And how do the vendor and the buyer meet? Who makes the introduction?
So. So like I was mentioning before, sometimes the seller hires a business broker, right? There's a listing, and the seller and the buyer meet that way. Other times, I'm doing one right now where there's a supplier, and the buyer and seller know each other because they've done business for years. I've seen ones with competitors. In terms of the actual concept of buying out the boss, if the buyer is a set of employees, or an employee-owned co-op, for example, that's how they can really meet. You generally, there's no one size fits all, no one formula. If you really are interested though in going out and selling your business, what I think the best thing to do though would be to retain a very credible business broker who can help you with some of this initial listings.
And if you don't know any, how do you find a very credible one?
Well, you can ask me.
There are professional standards there.
Yes, there are.
Certifications.
Yes, business brokers are like real estate agents regulated by the Real Estate and Business Brokers Act, and they have a code of ethics.
Yeah. I didn't want to say this until later, but I am a business broker.
Oh, excellent.
With lots of experience in the industry.
Oh,
and he's a credible one.
I mean, he's a credible one.
And how you meet people is you attend courses like this.
That was easy.
There you go. Yes.
It seems like to take over a very small business, then there's very few players. So how much of what you just presented do you advise that we could do on our own before we go to somebody like you? And what kind of fees are we looking at?
See, that's a hard question, because the stuff that you can do on your, what I set out is by nature stuff that you can't do on your own, right? Stuff that you need an accountant and a lawyer to help you with. Most of the time, if it's stuff that the business owners can do on their own, they've usually done the research themselves and tried to do it. But these are all things that require some type of professional expertise in order to make it happen. The fees would depend on how badly things are out. For example, if you go to a lawyer or you go to somebody who, at least, a business incorporation, somebody who knows how to incorporate, right? Then you incorporate, and you would usually pay a flat fee, and from the outset you're set and you're good to go, right? And if you haven't updated your minute book for say 5 years, it's not very hard. It's just a matter of passing a couple of resolutions, as long as you haven't brought in partners or done anything wonky, right? But the more transfers, the more kind of dealings that you've had with the shares of the business, or if you've missed tax returns or filings, the more expensive it gets. That's really what it comes down to.
So I don't know this gentleman, but I'll out myself and say I'm a lawyer. When you say that no matter
How many people are lawyers here?
Us too.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate your honesty and the fact that you're sitting here and telling us. And so I would just add to what you're saying that no matter what area of law it is, if you're a good lawyer like yourself, I can tell by the way you're addressing the crowd. So I don't know you, but I can tell by the way you're addressing the crowd that any lawyer, when you come to them, will tell you this is what you can do on your own, this is what you can research on your own, and this is my role. So this is what I'll charge. If you don't want to do it on your own, then I'll charge for that. I'll get a lot more. But if there is anything that you can do on your own, a good lawyer, I know like yourself, would tell them.
Absolutely, but you actually do need to have that initial meeting to sit down,
Yeah.
so that you can actually craft that division of labor,
and then always have your lawyers send you those terms of that agreement.
Exactly.
It's amazing how many lawyers don't.
It's general retainer.
Yeah.
Okay, next question in the back. Hi.
Hi.
So I'm embarrassed of my total ignorance. I'm a business owner, and I, for 20 years, and the whole, minute book and corporation, whatever. I am incorporated, but I'm like operating blind as to what it all means. So that whole thing that you just presented, was that basically like buying and selling a business, and one possible way of doing it would be to have a group of people come together and turn it into a co-op? Like, there was nothing particularly co-op-y in that.
Russ is going to talk about co-ops.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Good.
My focus was just on what the vendors need to think about in order to get the business ready to sell to a co-op.
Yeah, and okay, because the thing that I'm stuck on is you said so in my business I have this vision that maybe I can do something that's going to, transfer to the employees, and, then it'll be able to continue and I can retire someday and so on. And one thing you said is that selling is the seller's problem. Getting the business ready to sell is the seller's problem, and having the money to buy it. So that struck me very much more like the thing I've been thinking, well, that's impossible. Nobody's ever going to want to buy my business or have the money to do it. So
that's not necessarily true at all. I
okay.
mean, it really comes down to sitting down with you and with a credible business broker and a lawyer and an accountant,
right?
And going through this housekeeping checklist to figure out what you need to shore up. The only challenge is planning, really, right? You've got to give yourself a time horizon to be able to do this, and not try to do it all kind of scrunched into a really short.
Well, I've got a 20-year time horizon right now, so I'm kind of good. But maybe I'll get more enlightenment then when it goes into the more co-op-y stuff, because that was kind of all just like fantastic, and I get it, and I can see the value of planning, and really it's a checklist. And I'm still like, but how do I do it? Alternative structure. Okay, great.
My name is Warren Ragoonanan. I'm a business lawyer with Gardiner, Miller, Arnold, LLP, and I pretty much do startups, mergers, acquisitions, and with a lot of experience with the succession planning in small business owners. We got a lot of questions, a lot of audience participation, really good discussion on co-ops, and in particular how to buy them out and all the issues that have to be dealt with. I really liked the quality of the questions and the fact that people were so engaged. The issue is that it's under the radar for the most part, right? What I see is that a lot of people are talking about it, but nobody seems to know what to do with it, right? Where to go with it. And what's happening is that a lot of the baby boomers are getting ready to retire, and there's a lot of demand out there for these businesses. But the traditional ways of selling them are not cost effective enough to be able to utilize them. Right, so the baby boomers and the owners who operate these businesses are kind of left out in a limbo, right? And that's a lot of reason why it is that I end up getting involved most of the time. And I'm absolutely happy to help them because, there's a need for it. So did any of the questions surprise me? Not really. The questions were all fairly standard, and they were actually very in depth too. Some of them actually touched on issues that I hadn't even considered. Particularly, we had one question about whether or not corporations can own memberships in co-ops. And that's something that had never occurred to me, but it makes a lot of sense, and it's something that it's important to understand when you're structuring these types of deals.